Hello everyone, good evening. Is everyone doing well tonight? All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to join us for the 5th session of People's Planning Academy. My name is Andrea Miller. I'm a long-range planner for DMD, and I will be starting off this class. So our last session of PPA was about the fundamentals of TOD. So we talked about what TOD looks like, equitable TOD, and our sustainability plan, Thrive Indy. So we covered a lot of material, and you had some questions. You should have received an email from Brittany, which summarized the material and the sources, and also provided you with different resources that you can use moving forward. Our last session was on the fundamentals of TOD, so we had covered a lot of material, such as what TOD looks like, transit-oriented development, equitable TOD, and we talked about our sustainability plan, Thrive Indy. So today, our class is called Development 101. So previously, we've talked a lot about the government and policy side of it and what that looks like. And today, we're going to look at real estate development. So this is where the rubber kind of hits the road. To give you a better understanding of what actually goes into the process of making these different development decisions and properties. So that's what we'll lead off with, and then we'll go into an activity called a development scenario where we will ask you to play the part of the developer and create your own site. And then we will wrap up today's class with Brittany, who is going to come back up, and she's going to talk about how you as citizens can take action when it comes to these rezoning processes. And then we're also joined by Eddie Honey he is a senior planner of code revision, and he works in current planning. So he is our expert that will provide us with additional insight. So Development 101. This course is a focus on the real estate development side of things and how they actually get built. We talked about the history of transportation and how we got here. We've talked about why we want complete neighborhoods that use multimodal transit. So at this point, perhaps you're saying to yourself, okay, that's awesome. This is great. I agree. Let's do it. And so the question is, why isn't it happening then? Why aren't we making everything around our BRT lines transit-oriented development right now? Why aren't all of our communities being designed to be more walkable? And some of it is our limitations in public funding. We've talked about that a little bit. And some of it is related to our zoning ordinance, which we are currently working on changing to become more aligned with transit-oriented development. But it's more than that, right? Because we have things like this, which I don't know how clearly you can see it, but that is a rapid bus transit line station right in front of a used car lot. And this happens because while we control this, the bus station, we do not control this, which is a used car lot. That's privately owned property. We don't control that piece of property surrounding the Indigo bus stop. And similarly, when you look at around the city at our buildings, by and large, we haven't constructed or had control over that design either. We may build roads and sidewalks, occasionally parks, but the city does not develop property for the private market. So we don't, for example, build apartments and then sell them. You may be saying, well, I know we have zoning ordinance. I know you have rules. What are you talking about? So we do. We have our zoning ordinance that lays out this kind of groundwork. And as you may remember from class 1, for every rule that you put in place, it makes it more inflexible. So if you have someone who has a creative design, it makes it harder for them to build, and it can also drive up costs. So, and it doesn't always kick in, right? So if you have something that's zoned a particular way and you just keep it that way, we don't really have a say. We have those legally non-conforming properties. So in the second half of the session, Brittany is going to talk more about what role you can play when there is that rezoning process, but that's not always an opportunity that we have. Which leads us back to the purpose of this presentation. Because when we look at the city around us, it's private developers who build those buildings. They build the buildings you love and the ones that you hate. And there are partners in creating this built environment. So why do developers build anything? This is like a free comment. Why do developers build anything? He's going like this, right? So money, right. So he's right. So with the exception of a few nonprofits in our communities, developers are not going to pursue projects if they do not believe that they will be profitable. And even the nonprofits still need to generate revenue to continue operating. They don't just have infinite funding. And wanting to make a profit isn't by itself a bad thing. So I don't know if there are any small business owners in the room, but if you were a small business owner, would your goal be to break even? Probably not. You would want to make a little bit of money, right? Which isn't to say that developers can't cause harm in the communities they operate in, because they can and have. But developers, they are this integral part of building our city, and like it or not, they are motivated by profit. So it's important to understand a little bit about the types of things that they take into consideration when they're doing a project, to understand their perspective and have a better dialogue with them. So we're going to do a broad overview. We'll be focusing on 3 core demands a developer needs to meet in order for a real estate development project to be viable. So the first is market feasibility. This refers to whether the market can support that particular piece of development. Can you build that office building and expect to fill it with tenants? The second is financial feasibility. This focuses on whether you can make the numbers work. How much of a return on investment can you expect? What's the interest rate on the loan? Will the bank even give you a loan? Because you may think you have a great idea, but in some cases, whether the bank thinks you have a great idea is the more important question. And then you have political feasibility, where the interaction between the public and private side can kind of get a little bit more contentious. And right at the center of all 3 of these is where they all meet up, is where you have a viable project that goes forward. So let's dive a little bit more into each of these. So the first is market feasibility. So oftentimes when people think of demand, they'll think about their own personal relationship to wanting a product or service, and the fact that like maybe some of their friends want that product or service and everyone agrees we want this product or service, so why isn't it here? And there are a lot of different reasons, but when we talk, it's more about whether the numbers actually support that given entity in a certain area. So there are geographic and mobility factors. So how far people can travel. So as you may remember from that project where we asked you to try and see how far you can get, it's not as simple as just how close you are. You can actually end up needing to travel a lot farther. So the positioning of roads and highways will really affect this, as well as people's willingness to travel for it. So for example, you may be willing to drive a half hour for work, but you're probably not going to drive a half hour for a coffee. So those, the size and the area around a given business will change based off the entity. There are demographic factors. So this is the one that people often think about. How large is the population within that area you think people will be willing to travel? And this is where density for supporting businesses becomes so critical, because the more people you have in a smaller amount of area, the more it's able to support. How much do these people make? And is it something that everyone will buy, like groceries? Or is it something that will only draw from a smaller sliver of the market, like maybe a coffee shop? And of course, you need to assess your competition. So how many competitors in your industry exist in your market area? How close of a competitor are they? Can you differentiate yourself? Is there some way you can make yourself stand out? Walmart Grocery and Whole Foods both sell groceries, but they cater to very different markets. So figuring out all of these things is just step 1 to consider whether a project will be done. There is financial feasibility. So this focuses on whether you can actually make the numbers work to give you a profit at the end, right? So if you've ever heard of a pro forma before, this is where that comes into play, and if you haven't, that's fine. A pro forma analysis is what developers use to project their revenue and expenses for any given project. It's not precise, but it's the base groundwork for whether a development will be a go or no-go. Because at this point you may have established there's a market for your product, but if certain expenses are too high, the cost can be prohibitive. You might decide to not go ahead even though people want it. So the first section of the pro forma, and don't worry, we're not going to get too bogged down, but I do want to give you guys an overview of what this looks like, is project revenues. So you have things like the number of units, the average sale per unit, and commissions, what the agents make selling it. And all these calculations are pretty straightforward, nothing too fancy. But it goes without saying that all of these are projections. So if, let's say, the number of units changes, this entire formula changes, right? So let's say you were planning on doing a building that was 5 floors, 50 units, and let's say people come back, and whether it's the city or different groups, they don't want 5 floors, they want 4 floors. And you're like, great, well, I can do 40 units. So what does that mean for your project? Does that mean you're going to make the units more expensive? Or maybe that's not even a possibility given your market. Do you just drop the project altogether? So the second section to take a look at is project costs. And this covers everything from the cost of land, to putting in utilities, to planning and designing it, to the actual construction, and all the different people all those different steps require. The important thing to note on this section is that these are perhaps even more vulnerable to change than the projected revenue. If the cost of a certain building material, such as steel, let's say, suddenly increases, what does that do to your project? If the project runs into delays in approvals and it takes more time and extra fees and work to get it through, that's additional project costs. So these are very vulnerable to fluctuations. And of course, there's financing interest, right? You didn't just have this money on hand, most likely. You got a loan through a bank. So the money on top of your loan that you need to pay back to the bank is your financing interest. And for developers, it's years between when they initially get the financing and interest starts accruing and when they actually sell anything and get revenue from it, right? So delays in construction under this system can be very costly. If you've ever driven past one of those construction sites that it seems like nothing is happening there, like nothing has been happening there for, it seems like forever, at least a year, just remember, as much as you hate that, I'm sure the people developing that project aren't particularly enjoying that process either. Which leads us to the final decision now. Do we want to go ahead with this project? So there are a number of different figures at the bottom portion of this particular pro forma, because each one, there are a lot of different options that real estate developers use, but we are going to focus on this particular pro forma. We're going to look at 2. That's net cash flow to developer and the internal rate of return, also known as the IRR. So, net cash flow to developer. This is essentially the profit the developer expects to make. Very simply. So it's project revenue minus project costs and minus financing interest. Very simple. But this isn't actually the key indicator for whether a developer will want to take on this project. Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas as to why it is not?
Future revenues.
Hmm?
They're looking at the future revenues, the annual into the future.
Yes. So you're talking about like, oh, well, I'm not getting that money now. It's coming to me, right? So quick question for you guys. Would anyone be willing to loan me $10,000? Oh, you're laughing, but I promise to pay you back. I have excellent credit. And not only will I pay you back, I will also give you interest. So I'll give you $500 interest plus your principal, and I'll pay this back in 4 years. Any takers? People are laughing at me. I think I'm a very promising business owner, and you all are laughing at me. So why would you not want to do that?
It's not a lot of money.
That's not a lot of money.
I mean, you're just, for a $10,000 investment, $500 is not a lot to make over
Yeah.
4 years.
Yes, exactly. So similarly, when you look at these projects, and sometimes people will look at a project and they're like, oh, but look at all this profit, and it's like, how many years of investment and waiting and risk did that group have to take on to get a certain return? Which is not to say they can never be, take advantage of anything, but I think oftentimes people just look at the raw profit. And it's important to remember that this is money that they'll be getting in the future, and that really affects this dynamic. Which leads us to the second part, the internal rate of return. So the formal definition of the IRR is that it is the interest rate that makes the net present value of all cash flows from a project equal to 0. And if that has you going, I have no idea what you just said. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the time value of money, but what I think is important for you to focus on when you think about the internal rate of return is that it takes into account the interest earned on investments. Just like you told me, $500 back on a $10,000 investment, that is not a good business decision. Similarly, developers aren't looking at raw profit. They'll look at the internal rate of return or some other financial measures. So, political feasibility. Because, of course, it's never as simple as those raw numbers, and developments are vulnerable to being bogged down in controversy. So for any given project, a developer needs to secure entitlements, which are the legal rights or approvals to develop a property for a particular use. So in essence, you have to be granted permission from these local regulatory agencies before you go ahead and do the development. And you can't just buy a piece of land and then go to Home Depot and come back and start building a house. That's not how any of this works, as I'm sure all of you realize. So this thing can include things like rezonings, if that's necessary. It can also include, for new developments, things like utility approvals, road approvals, environmental approvals, and these all involve going to different entities within the city and beyond to go ahead and get all the proper permissions for these developments. And controversy can come from multiple sources as you're going through these stages. It can come from the city, who may feel that a certain project doesn't align with their goals. It can come from the communities themselves. Sometimes the cities and communities agree, and other times we don't. But the important thing to remember is that controversy equals uncertainty, and uncertainty in this process is the enemy of the developer. So I mentioned previously, the more that time drags on, the more interest that accrues. It can add extra fees. It can just add a lot of extra time, and time is money. And in addition to all these different aspects, you're waiting to get your money, you're trying to, your interest is accruing, there's also an opportunity cost associated with this. So what other project could you have been pursuing instead of this, instead of having your project get bogged down and dragged through the mud? So even though a developer is motivated by profit, it's important to remember that there's more than one type of consideration or calculation done when considering a real estate development project, and that the developer is aware of these different vulnerabilities. And right at the center is where you have a development that can happen. So now we're going to move into the activity portion of tonight. We could continue to talk about trade-offs in real estate development, but instead we're going to give you the opportunity to do a little bit of hands-on. So a little bit of background before we let you go to it. There's some storytelling involved tonight. The premise. So you are a real estate developer located near the fictional city of Idino. The city has put out a request for proposals, so the city is asking for developers to submit a bid for the sale and redevelopment of a site. So the site is about 5 acres. It's in the Greencrook neighborhood on the south side of Idino. So the 5-acre site has 2 different sections. The first is a 2-acre abandoned production facility. The abandoned bakery is a historic building. It was built in the early 1900s, and at one point it made and distributed its goods throughout Idino. But it's fallen into severe disrepair, and it would need significant investments to be functional. And then the other 3 acres, a little bit less interesting. They're just some vacant land. So the city has a few goals that they would like you to address. The first is to provide public space. So the neighborhood of Greencrook doesn't have a lot of park or other public space available. 2, support all modes of transportation. So this city is traditionally car dependent, and recently the city has started to begun pursuing more alternative modes of transportation, and they want new development to support that. 3, provide additional affordable housing. And 4, provide space for non-retail businesses that will employ the local community. And now we have the residents of Greencrook. So they are car dependent. And because they're car dependent, parking availability is a major concern for them here. They're concerned that if less parking spaces are provided, that the car parking will just spill over into their neighborhood streets. 2, they're concerned that the redevelopment project might be significantly taller and loom over the surrounding area. So most of the buildings in this area, they're only 1 or 2 stories. So if you just all of a sudden drop a 5-story building here, they're not going to like that. 3, they're concerned at the possibility of a large apartment complex coming. They state that they're concerned about destroying the character of the neighborhood. We are a small, single-family, cute neighborhood. 4, would like to see the historic bakery preserved. They have this attachment to this bakery. They value what it stood for and what it is and the architecture and history behind it. 5, they support providing opportunities for job growth and work. So they're kind of with the city on that one about the idea of providing non-retail business space. And they'd also like a grocery store. So they've got a nice little laundry list for you. And so now we have your assignment. So you may now open the envelope that is on your table in front of you. All right. Got a little bit more explanation, but it'll make more sense if you're looking at it. All right. So in front of you are a variety of different tiles. You should locate 4 tiles. These are a bit larger than the rest. These are your base option tiles. So this tells you the big picture idea of what you are going to do for the redevelopment site. And located near the top of those tiles is a box with 3 different dimensions. So first it says appeal to city staff. So this dimension assesses how well the city likes this idea, and as a result, how likely it is to award you the project. The second is appeal to the neighborhood. This dimension assesses how well the neighborhood likes the idea. Strong vocal opposition has the potential to sink the entire project. And 3 is developer project. This dimension just assesses how well the project ideas will do in generating you some revenue. And then we also have the little adaptation tiles though, because if I just told you to pick one of the 4, that would be boring. So the adaptation tiles have a way for you to change the development a little bit and change the perception of it. So for example, 1 is make 10% of all units affordable. This makes the city happier and your developer profit will go down as a result. So your mission is to craft a proposal that will have the city award you the project, avoid significant criticisms from Greencrook residents, but most importantly to you, it will also make you a profit. You can choose 1 base option, up to 3 of your adaptation tiles in creating your site. So you will have 15 minutes for this activity. So take some time to read the tiles and then work with your group to come up with a plan. at the end of the time, we'll come back and have a discussion. But just remember, it's all a balancing act as you go forward. It's time. Let's see what you guys came up with. All right. So, does anyone want to share the plan for their site? So, what did you come up with? And also, what was your philosophy and justification behind it? If you had one, maybe you didn't, but based off what I saw and heard when I was walking around, you did. So does anyone want to share what they came up with? So shy. All right, here, this table.
We chose option number 1.
Okay.
And up to 3 adaptations.
Did we all have the same options?
Yes. Yeah.
Number 1, swap out the parking, put bike parking in.
Okay.
Number 4, make 10% of the parking units affordable. And 11, preserve and restore the historic bakery sign.
All right. So it's interesting. You not only kept the bakery, you also decided to preserve the sign. So did you have a particular strategy in mind, just overall?
We weren't doing a lot to make the city happy. We figured the neighborhood pressure would be helpful to influence the city. Because if they were frowned, we figured one of these turned into a plaque. We needed some residents about it.
All right. That's an interesting perspective.
Question.
Yes.
I thought, my dissenting opinion or something,
Yes.
that you could have had a grocery store within the bakery along with housing above it or something like that. Could there have been like a grocery store card?
I will put that in mind for any future iterations of this game. Mental note.
There was only one option to do a grocery store, and it was demolishing the bakery.
That's true. All right. What about anyone else? Any other groups? That one in the back.
Okay, we actually realized it was a math game and there was multiple options, but the first one we came up with was option 4. For the grocery store. So demolish the old bakery, build a grocery store. We added number 4 to make 10% of the apartment units affordable, preserve the bakery, and use less expensive landscaping. And our philosophy there was compromise. So really we just kind of achieved a true neutral. City appeal was medium, neighborhood appeal was medium, and developer cost was still too money bags, so they'll probably still fund it.
All right. So any other site plans that people were proud of or just want to share? Yeah.
Well, since ours is similar to theirs, I thought I'd share. We chose option 1 as well. I think it was important to us that we started off with the neighborhood being happy, and then the developer profit. We figured it needed to be, at least somewhat substantial. And then to make the city happy, we chose a 4 for the make 10% of the apartment units affordable, but that made the developer profit go down. So to make the developer profit go up, we chose 3, and then that made the neighborhood appeal go down. So to make the neighborhood appeal go up, we chose to preserve the number 11, to preserve the sign, because we figured even though that makes the developer profit go down, we thought maybe it wouldn't make it go down too much.
All right. Okay. So we've gotten a few site plans out there. So I'm going to ask for a raise of hands. How many of you chose base option 1? Raise your hand. Oh, wow. All right. So base option 2. Base option 3. No one chose 3. Interesting. And number 4. I know we have 2 groups.
At our table, we all came up with different solutions.
Oh, so you couldn't compromise between the 3 of you. All right, let's. All right, I'm curious. Let's hear about option 5.
Option 5 is that we throw developer profits out the window. We do community land trust.
All right.
That way we keep affordable housing.
Okay.
Because Greencrook can probably get some federal grant money to help cover this.
You say that with such confidence.
I realize when you throw developer profits out in the city, the Greencrook folks take over it. Then you don't have to worry about the profit margins for the developer. You can just go project. You take that overhead out. Bakery building can be an office space. You want to keep the bakery building because you're 5 miles out from the city core, so you need a draw. A nice historic building done well for great clients. I think maybe a grocery store co-op. I haven't really thought this all up.
But she's got lots of ideas. So did anyone else engage in some creative site design for this? Or did the rest of you, stick to the rules?
I say walk away from the whole thing. It's just, that was my solution.
Yeah, don't develop at all, like, right? Why are we dealing with this? All right.
Just on those notes, and just one little editorial comment here. This works real well in the physical city and for a fictional city.
Yes.
I don't know. But for your education and everyone else's information, DMD on the one hand is doing this really nice exercise, but on the other hand, in my neighborhood, recently something happened that was completely the opposite. So, not going, and I mentioned this before, people can ask me about it, but speaking of demolition and whatnot, but so this is wonderful, that, this is the concept and the ideas that hopefully going forward will be uniform.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's fair because certain neighborhoods do get more attention and more involvement, and that's something that we're working on trying to fix, but it's a big city.
With one government, basically.
One government.
One DMD.
One DMD, yeah. But that's a fair criticism. That's something we're aware of and working on. Yes?
There were some assumptions that I want to just bring up that were made that the developer will lose money if they put in, for example, bike racks or something, or that the developer profit will go down if they preserve the sign, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And what many developers are finding that, in fact, if you make investments like upgraded landscaping and upgraded amenities, it actually improves the marketability of the site. So that we couldn't quite come to that.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. However, I had to build in to create this game a certain set of assumptions. So you're right, though. Those are the types of things that people are increasingly coming to value, but that mindset isn't uniform throughout the development community. But that's a good point to bring up, and I'm glad you did that. This, perception that necessarily enhancing a certain aspect of the building isn't necessarily going to cause isn't going to be detrimental to profits. So moving on, how many of you tried to balance all three of your dimensions, or just raise your hand? How many of you actually tried to balance all three of the different ones? All right, so a good portion of you guys did. I already heard your perspective, but did anyone else, I'm picking on you because it's fun, but did anyone else try and prioritize one particular dimension, and if so, why? Yes?
Well, we kind of looked more at the community, I can't think of the term now that was on the card. Yeah, the neighborhood liking something more, because if the local immediate neighborhood is more in support of your project, that can override some city concerns, because the local neighborhood is more in favor, and they're more likely to support it, be there, utilize it when it's built, that sort of thing. So we went more that way, even if we took more away from the profit, because the long-term profit could be healthier than just the initial build cost.
Yeah. Yes?
I picked the one that allowed there to be a grocery store, because I looked after one too, but there was no grocery store option, and I'm a little concerned that most of these people value an old building over maybe helping out people on a food day. they want food. So
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, and kind of my last question before the next phase: how many of you actually like your plan? How many? Oh, okay. We do have a few hands. So the first time I did this exercise, literally not a single person liked what they came up with. I was like, isn't that interesting? So why didn't you guys end up liking what you came up with? You were the ones who did it. No comments?
As I told these guys, I had to move back here from San Francisco a while back, and I hate the whole live-work thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, which, and that comes from depending on how tight zoning is and how that thing is supposed to be.
Okay.
A little personal life.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, this was a lot of fun for you guys, at least for me. I'm hoping for you guys as well. But now it's time to add up your points. So I didn't tell you this at the beginning, but each of your decisions has a given number of points attached to it. So I would like you to add up the points for each of your different categories, and we'll see what you guys come up with. I'll give you like 2 minutes to go ahead and add it up. So, you can get, obviously you can get a range of points in each of these categories. Ideally, the total points in each of them should be closer to 10 than 1. So since you guys have had a chance to add up, did anyone have a category with a really low point total?
What's really low?
What's really low? Closer, so anything less than 5.
What?
Oh, okay. So what did you end up getting?
A 2 for profit for developer
A
points.
2 for developer profit. All right, and what was really high in response? You decided, that's right, because you said you prioritized neighborhood. All right, did anyone else have one category that was like less than 5, let's say? Yeah? Your developer profit was less than 5? So there are a couple of groups that if you were maybe you could approach your local CDC, but if you were a for-profit developer, you probably would not be going through with your projects right now. All right, so why do you guys think we didn't tell you about the points to begin with? Huh? Bias your decisions. It was one part bias your decisions. Anyone have any other thoughts?
Do you not want to be teaching to the test, maybe?
Yeah, I didn't want to be teaching to the test, so that was definitely one. I didn't want you guys just trying to calculate how many points was in each and not really think about it. Any other thoughts?
I don't know if this is intentional. I don't know if we were necessarily trying to cater to the neighborhood. I think we just accidentally lost more money than we were expecting. So
Yeah.
as it went through, we were just like,
Interesting. And that back table, it looks like you had some thoughts.
Those long-term goals that we can't really predict what they would be, but what they end up being at the end.
Yeah, so that was one of the key things is that when you're trying to come up with these projects, you generally have an idea of how these different things will influence your project, but you don't really have a precise idea of exactly how they'll influence the final decision, right? You may know the neighborhood feels a certain way. You don't realize just how much they care about that bakery. You may know the city wants you to have multimodal transit. You don't realize just how much they hate it when you put in all this parking. So similar to life, when you were first going through and doing this site plan, you didn't know exactly how each group felt. And you could say, well, with developer profit, you would know for sure, but as we discussed before, there's a lot of uncertainty in trying to project these costs. So I hope you enjoyed this little activity.
What's a good score?
So I didn't come up with an exact yes, A+ score, but like I said, closer to 10. So if you had an 8 or 9 in a category, that's a good score. So that means that's a fine balance between all of them.
I think this is the best game so far.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. All right, so we are now going to move on to the next section of our course, which is about being involved in the zoning process. So I kind of skimmed over quickly. I mentioned, oh yeah, rezonings, they happen. But Brittany's going to give you a little bit more detail about what you can do in that process.
All right. I'm glad we got the fun out the way. I'm not the fun, so I'm sorry. You've had fun today, though. Early on in the academy, we had some feedback from you guys that you wanted to know, what you can actually do. And I think this is a really appropriate time, because the reality is it's not unusual for developments to require, or not require, but request rezoning and variances. So let's dive right in. And then also want to remind us that we have an awesome expert in the audience, Eddie Honey. So he's going to be a resource to us when it's time to ask questions at the end. Yeah, so just a quick refresher. There were two parts of zoning: the map, which assigns a zoning district to every parcel of land in Marion County, and the ordinance, which establishes the rules. Changes are made to each of these. However, to the map, changes to the map happen much more frequently than the ordinance. Changes to the map may occur multiple times throughout the year. So let's talk about how those changes and how you can get involved. So this is really simplified, but these are the most common types of zoning changes: rezoning, variance of use, and variance of development standards. I'll provide examples of each of these in just a minute, but first let's talk about how the changes occur. So this is a graphic to represent the process. Each of these changes begin with the land use petition, which is a formal request for one of these changes. Then a public notice is given 23 days before the hearing about the land use petition. The notice is given in 3 ways: via mail to surrounding property owners and registered neighborhood organizations and the city county council. The public notice is also posted in the Indy Star, and most of you have seen the orange and black yard signs, which is the third way a public notice is given. Those yard signs are posted at the site of the petition. The petition is then reviewed by city planning staff, who create a report which includes their recommendation to either approve or deny the request. Staff reports are published in 7 days, 7 days prior to the public hearing about the land use petition. So variances and rezonings have different processes with different hearing bodies. Nearly all variance cases are finalized once the Board of Zoning Appeals makes their decisions. The rezoning process begins with, after the staff report, the hearing examiner provides a recommendation to either appeal or deny. And then the MDC either affirms the decision of the hearing examiner, or if there's an appeal, then they'll hear that appeal. Then finally, the city county council adopts the rezoning. So each one of these boxes represents a hearing that takes place. So the rezoning process is a 3-hearing process, just to make sure that's clear. All right, so now I'll talk briefly about the entities that are involved in the process. So first, there's a city planning staff. Staff is available to assist in making a decision. They provide an objective planning opinion for the overall public interest. In each of these cases, regardless of it's a rezoning or variance, the decision-making body is a group of appointed citizens. Professional planners like me, DMD, do not make zoning or variance decisions. Planners provide advice and recommendations, but we don't make the actual decision. So just be clear, I don't make the decision. So. Next, the hearing examiner makes recommendations, as I mentioned, to the MDC to either approve or deny rezonings. The hearing examiner is appointed by the MDC. Speedway and the Regional Center have special hearing examiners. The Metropolitan Development Commission is comprised of a bipartisan group of 9 citizen members. 5 are appointed by the mayor, and no more than 3 of the same political party can be appointed. and the other 4 are appointed by the City County Council, and no more than 2 of those can be of the same political party. The MDC affirms or hears appeals of recommendations of the hearing examiner, but the MDC also approves changes to the ordinance. So you elect 25 city county councilors, and they finalize zoning changes. So last, the Board of Zoning Appeals is comprised of 5 citizen members, of which 2 are appointed by the mayor, 2 by the City County Council, and 1 is appointed by the MDC. Variance petitions are heard by the BZA. They have the authority to approve or deny those petitions. Beech Grove, Lawrence, and the town of Speedway are known as excluded cities, and they have their own BZAs. All right, so let's discuss a little bit about the rezonings. These are changes to the entire zoning district. So for example, this is a graphic of a snapshot of a zoning map. And this property was zoned as I-4 in industrial district, rezoned to an rezoned to an I-1, which is a less intensive rezoning district. So that's an example of what that can look like. So far in 2019, there have been over 100 rezonings, just to give you an idea. So how does this occur? How are these decisions made? The state statute dictates that a rezoning can be granted only if very specific criteria are met. These are the criteria that the MDC evaluates and includes as findings of fact. According to state statute, the MDC must pay reasonable regard to the comprehensive plan. This means asking what is the objective of the comprehensive plan, what is it trying to accomplish, and what has changed since the plan's adoption. The MDC must also consider the current conditions and characters of the structures and uses in each district. So this means asking, is there compatibility with surrounding development patterns? Has the MDC or BZA made decisions indicating a shift in policy? They must also consider the most desirable use for which the land in each district is adapted. This can mean asking if there are physical limitations or advantages to the site. Consideration must also be given to the conservation of property values throughout the jurisdiction. This can mean asking what is the effect on property values of the immediate area and the county as a whole. They must make considerable development and growth. They must consider reasonable development and growth. This means asking if there's a place for everyone. Are we inclusionary? Is there a balanced amount of different uses? The MDC must also give consideration to the general policy and pattern of development set out in the comprehensive plan. Does it fulfill the vision laid out in the plan? Is it acceptable deviation from a specific recommendation? And how will it affect the future implementation of the plan's goals? So I know that's a lot of information, but I think it's valuable that you understand these are the specific criteria that are considered by the BZA.
Does that ever change?
No.
Don't be shy, how do you feel?
I think it does change, because a lot of those are subject to interpretation, including depending on who staff is.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that in just a minute, but some of these are really based on the hearing body and how they interpret it, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So since the ordinance regulates permitted uses and development standards, there are 2 basic types of variances. So variance of use and variance of development standards. So far in 2019, there have been over 240 variance requests, include like both types. All right, so let's discuss the variances for development standards. A variance of development standards petition would be necessary when a property owner wants to build something that does not meet the standards of the zoning ordinance related to how something can be built in a district. As a reminder, the Board of Zoning Appeals makes the final decision regarding variances. So an example, in one class we talked about how everything in this illustration is impacted by zoning. So this means changes to development standard could include the building height, the setback, parking, landscaping, signage, and a lot more. Right. Okay. For the variance of development standards, sorry, let me go back. Okay. For a variance of development standards to be granted, the BZA must determine all three of these statements are true, and those findings must be based upon fact, similar to the rezonings. So these findings must be proven by evidence and arguments in the record. Evidence must take the form of expert testimony, photographs, reports, site plans, drawings, etc. So this means the criteria does not include judgment or opinion. All right, so let's talk about this criteria a little bit more closely. So finding one, the approval will not be injurious to the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare of the community. So this is written very broadly. It's an overarching umbrella to accommodate changes over time, technology, types of uses, evolving health concerns, changing moral standards, etc. The term community is used when which does not limit the application to property owners, citizens, residents, but rather includes everyone. So this first finding and the second finding are exactly the same as variance of uses. So finding two, the phrase use and value, let me read it for those of you that may not be able to see it. The use and value of the area adjacent to the property included in the variance will not affect in a substantially adverse manner. So the phrase use and value specifically addresses two items, not just property values, but also the use of the property. This would bring in the quality of life issues. The words area adjacent to the property is not quantified. It is not limited to the immediate neighborhood, neighboring property. And finally, the term substantially adverse manner indicates that the impact must be negative, not just different. And the impact must be substantial, not just some negative, but a significant impact. These determinations are also subject to the BZA's judgment. Finding three, the term, I keep forgetting that you guys may not be able to see this. The strict application of the terms of the zoning ordinance will result in practical difficulties in the use of the property. So the term practical difficulty calls for a reasonable approach to whether there's a problem that extreme measures are not called for in order to meet the ordinance. So again, the BZA determines what is impractical and impractical. Finding three also clearly focuses on the decision-making to be about the property, not about the people per se, by using the phrase use of property. Okay, so this is an example of variance of use. A variance of use petition would be necessary when a property owner wants to use property for use not permitted in an applicable zoning district. So the property maintains existing zoning, but allows use of land that is not permitted by right. So in this example, imagine you're a business owner and you would like to convert your, I know you don't like this, but just imagine.
I'm thinking other things too.
Yeah. Okay. Imagine you're a business owner and you would like to convert your single-family home to a live-work unit. So this use is not allowed in the zoning district, so if you want to do this, you must file a variance request. So as I mentioned, the first two findings are exactly the same as the variance of development standards. Finding 3, the need for the variance arises from some condition peculiar, oh, I hate that word, peculiar, you know what I'm trying to say, to the property involved. So this clearly focuses on the decision-making to be about the property, not about the people. The neighborhood surroundings are not to be considered because neighborhoods change, level of upkeep, reinvestment style, all change over time. The reason must be something odd about the property. The next one, the strict application of the terms of the zoning ordinance will constitute an unnecessary hardship if applied to the property for which the variance is sought. So this is similar to finding 3 in development standards. The difference between development standards and use is found in the terms practical difficulty versus unusual and necessary hardship. These two terms were intentionally chosen. They dictate a difference in level of scrutiny. Hardship is a higher test for more difficult burden of proof than practical difficulty. Finding 4 also limits the hardship to the property that is in the application, not the neighborhood and not an adjoining lot. The modifying word strict is also used to describe the application is also used. This suggests that the general application or intention is still relevant, but the specificity of the ordinance is what is at issue. All right, and I'll answer questions right after the last one. So the last criteria, the approval does not interfere substantially with the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan includes sub-area plans, the thoroughfare plan, design guidelines, all of those things that we discussed in class 5. It does not say compliance with a comprehensive plan. The term interfere substantially offers flexibility for changes that occur after the adoption of the plan, possibilities of something that still meets the intention of the comp plan, and for the Board of Zoning Appeals to use their judgment regarding what is substantial or significant. So I know that's a lot of legalese, but I think it's important for you to know that. So are there any questions about this? Do you have a question?
So, empty lot across the street from a soccer field. Well, they could park in this empty space for the kids to play soccer. Well, now they're building mixed use apartments and businesses or whatever there. But the parking goes away for the soccer field. It is not it's across the street, I guess, technically. So is there some consideration given to the fact that soccer field, kids play, parents, adults would drive these kids here, they need the extra parking, but now with this mixed use building going up. The people living there and shopping there are not going to even spill over and take the parking spaces because they will get there first for the kids playing soccer. So you're destroying a whole kids area. Is there any, is that a thought? I mean, I don't see comprehensive plan. Well, no, because what you're putting up is taxes to the city. It fits around it because there's businesses and other houses, but it had nothing to do with the kids playing soccer.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure of all the details of that specific incident, like what specifically that you're describing. Eddie, do you have anything that you want to add about?
Sure. I'm going to address this as kind of a hypothetical because I'm not familiar with the specifics of whatever circumstance you're alluding to. But if there's a soccer field that's been built somewhere, odds are it's either as part of a church, it's as part of a school, as part of a park system. In other words, it's likely zoned something that's going to warrant a level of review prior to its construction. And as part of that review, if we see that there's no on-site parking or no parking plan provided, that's going to be something that we bring up at that time before we even stamp off on approving its construction. Alternatively, a way you could look at it is, okay, if there's a soccer field and across the street there's a vacant lot and people are parking there, well, we're going to ask ourselves, number one, what's that property zoned? Odds are it's probably zoned residential, so they shouldn't be using it as a parking lot in the first place. Or even if it's zoned commercial, there's still probably a question of whether or not it should be used as essentially a surface lot anyways. But in number three, we're going to look at, well, does whoever owned that soccer field own that vacant lot? So there are all types of hypothetical things that could be considered, but if somebody purchased that vacant lot and they want to do something else with it, then essentially its historical use as a parking lot for that soccer field is not likely to come into play in staff's consideration of recommending approval or denial, and should they even have to come before us, because they could buy that lot and want to do something that they can do by right, in which case the city has no say in any event. Does that answer your question?
And thank you, Eddie. And actually, just for the sake of time, I think some of your questions might be answered with this next portion about specifics, how you can get involved and make sure your voice is heard, when these occur. So, can you just give me just a second?
Okay.
So now I'll tell you about a 6-step process you can use to get more involved. So the first thing you can do is be more informed. Neighbors can sometimes be the last to know about a project. They may receive only minimal information, maybe just a legal notice, and many neighbors are unfamiliar with land use decision making. But good thing that you're here, because you're taking the first step in learning about these processes. So you can keep a lookout for public notices. Early in their presentation, I mentioned there are 3 ways that you can, 3 ways that the hearing notices are distributed. So through the mail, in the Indy Star, and then hearing signage. But you can also use the Citizen Access Portal to access permitting information and look at those cases for yourself. You can use Map Indy to research a property and find out specifics about the property, so that's a good resource for you. You can also look at the zoning ordinance yourself. So MuniCode is a platform that we use to house the ordinance. It's over a 700-page document, so this allows you to search in the document. So specifically, chapters 740 through 744 are the chapters that you want to look out for this. Also, you can organize. So make sure your neighborhood group is registered in our system. Registered community organizations receive notifications for public hearings regarding rezonings, variances, special exceptions, a bunch of things happening in your community. So make sure you go to our website. Yeah, it's right there. Also communicate with a petitioner. Am I behind? Yeah. All right, so you can communicate with a petitioner. They're encouraged to reach out to the neighborhoods, but they're not required to. So if you haven't been contacted by them, you can reach out to them. Also communicate with the planning staff, call or email them. Although there are very specific rules that must be followed, staff must work with everyone, and we try to work with everyone fairly. So to that end, there are some basic constraints. You want to make sure that, because time is limited, on-site meetings are typically avoided due to some time constraints. Also, all information is public record. Staff cannot be expected to keep secrets or hide evidence. So in just a second, I'll talk about the public record and why, the official record, and you can't necessarily talk to the BZA, you can't talk to the MDC off record. Everything needs to be recorded, and it's a part of the decision making. Early contact is appreciated. Background information is appreciated, such as a history, photos, and past violations. And the staff will also work with you to find a solution. So here's the information for the on-call planner that you can contact about these issues. And lastly, as I mentioned, do not communicate with the BZA or the MDC. Everything needs to be a part of the official record. And once you do organize, you want to make sure that you weigh the alternatives. Are there modifications that can be made that eliminate or reduce negative impacts? Can modifications be made to the request that take the form of conditions or commitments? And also, if you have a condition or commitment, make sure that it's in writing. It's not just the word of the petitioner that you're taking. Next, before the hearing actually occurs, you want to make sure that you're prepared for it by meeting with other people who will attend the meeting. You'll have a very limited amount of time, so you want to be sure you use your time wisely. Here are a few tips to help your group prepare for the meeting. Be sure you understand the details of the petition. Don't assume. You should have reached out to the petitioner. Don't panic. You want to think about the proposals logically and identify the issues. Seek advice. Seek advice, as I mentioned, from the city staff. Also, don't be afraid to ask for a continuance. If you need more time, both sides receive a 30-day continuance. So you have one if you're a petitioner or if you're the opposition, also known as a remonstrator. So Brad keeps giving me the signal. I'm running out of time, so I'm just speed through this a little bit. I'll make sure you have the slides. So this is a graphic that illustrates the three entities that inform the hearing outcome. So the remonstrators, the people who are opposing the petitions, the petitioners and their advocates, or their supporters who are advocating for the petition, and the recommendations from the city staff. All right, so this is a layout of the format of the hearing. Most important thing I want you to get from this is that you don't have a lot of time. So if you're a petitioner, you and your neighbors collectively have 15 minutes. So you want to be succinct in what you have to say. You want to make sure that you're not rambling, but keep that 15 minutes in mind. And when when the hearing actually occurs, here's some presentation tips. Be organized, use visual aids. And be organized, I mean, remember those criteria for each one of those changes to the zoning ordinance, to the land use. Also, again, a reminder about the time. Limit the time to less than 3 speakers. Yeah. And be respectful in practice. Sorry I'm rushing. I'm running out of time. I thought I had more time. All right. Are there any questions? I'll have Eddie and Andrea come on up. Questions overall.
I've said this before, I just want to point out that one reality, which is that if you want to turn a single-family home into, say, a live work, then you have to go through that procedure, which is great. And various other applications besides live work. However, if you want to turn that single family into a hotel, then all that is out the window simply because you call it an Airbnb. And Fred has answered this before, but you know, that's a tax here, so, and it has nothing to do with the legislature. So hopefully we can get a handle on that at some point, and then everything on your slide there will be consistent reality.
Any other questions?
How often are the members of the BZA or the other authorities appointed?
So 4-year, 1-year term, right? 1-year terms.
In this process, and we're fighting this on the west side, we've had a zoning thing, they pulled it, they're going to refile after the elections. It's already been, the board is more or less sided with the neighborhood. But then you come down to the problem of it goes to the other inspector and he hears it. And if he fails it, then the city county councilor can still go to the councilors and get it approved. What do they need so many shots at this for? The councilors, they got 2 people appointed on this one committee, 2 people appointed on the other one, then they get a shot at saying yes or no. We don't listen, we don't agree with what you want to do with it.
Yep. So you mentioned a point that wasn't represented in that diagram that I showed you. Counselors do have an opportunity to bring up an issue to full council. So as long as it's in that zoning district. So that's. Do you have anything to say? Yeah. Tom?
Just want to make sure that people know the BZA and the NPC members, they are volunteers.
Yes.
Who, so they're serving the community when they do this work.
Mm-hmm.
They're not receiving any compensation.
Right.
Might get lunch or something. But do they get some sort of introduction to the kinds of things we've been exposed to in these sessions about what's transit-oriented development, what are the goals of the comprehensive plan, what are the objectives, the economic development objectives of the particular administration of the city, so that when something comes before them and they review it objectively, they have some sort of a framework to operate with.
So they do. We recently provided a presentation to the MDC, and then we have ongoing conversations with the counselors about our efforts that are underway in regards to transit. I'm not as familiar with the onboarding process when it comes to the commission and the board. Are you familiar?
Yeah, so essentially at the beginning of the year, we do have an orientation for the different boards and commissions, even if they're comprised of the same people from the previous year. And we have ongoing training as we can do that throughout the year as well.
Staff gets training too on these things to get updated on that? Because there's a lot of stuff gets thrown at.
We are working on the staff.
Before you kind of saying this, there's been 100 applications, 240 applications, different types. Is it more common than not that variances get approved or changes get approved, or are most denied, or is it like 50-50? Does that make sense?
I can't give you exact numbers, but for the most part, I would say definitely more than half the time, the boards and commissions side with staff, no matter what that recommendation is. Because sometimes, the request is unreasonable, but most of the time it's not that unreasonable.
Okay, and I guess like people applying, or most variances, I guess like if like from the developer side of things, are most variances granted? Or does the code usually take front like that? Does that make sense?
It's just real site specific because I'd say at least 30 to 35% of the requests that we see are in neighborhoods that were platted in the 1800s and they're substandard lots. So, you know, there are certain standards that they just can't meet and expect to put a house on there, like in Fountain Square. So, you know, maybe 85% to 95% of those requests get approved, and that kind of skews the math across the board.
Any other questions? All right. All right, well, thank you so much. I know my part was a lot of information. Feel free to, if you have any other questions, to I'll be hanging around after class.
I just want to announce that your good efforts were recognized by the New York Times today.
Oh.
Yes. Anybody see that? 36
I didn't
hours.
know that.
36 hours in Indianapolis talking about what a great town it is. It's actually Brad.
Yeah, they do that.
Thanks, Brian.